Greetings, all. Welcome back to the Coptimizer Podcast. Today, we've got retired police officer, author, private security company owner, writer, and just all around good guy, right?
Sure, we'll
Chris
go with that.
Hoyer. Chris Hoyer, thanks for being here.
Absolutely. That's my honor. Thank you, Patrick. Appreciate it.
All right, Chris. Why don't you just take a minute and give the audience a little bit of background about who you are, what agency you worked with, and then we're going to jump right in because I love the opening line, or it's one of the opening lines of your book, and every cop in America knows cops just like you. And maybe a little hint of what's coming.
I hope that's a good thing. So yeah.
Oh, it's a good thing and a bad thing, right?
Oh yeah.
It depends on the day.
Right. So so I'm Chris Hoyer. I was born in New England back in the late 60s. In fact, I'm not sure I wasn't born on the Woodstock lawn, but whatever. That's another conversation. So um did all my time with Phoenix PD from 97 when I got hired on, when I called it quits in 2018. Did my 20 years in 64 days, as a matter of fact. So um my career was interesting. We'll just say that it had a whole lot of really good stuff until my 18th year, and then everything fell apart. Um, and when I retired, I wasn't at all what I ever thought it was going to look like when I physically retired. The reason why, and if we get a chance to talk about that, I will. So, but it was good. I had a great time. So,
Yeah, well, no time like the present.
so 20 years and about 30 days into it, give or take. So we're talking about June of 2018, right? Respond to a call, comes out as an armed robbery / kidnapping, and I'm a mile away. And I won't give away why that I was a mile away, because I was always that close to whatever it was. And get to the call, and it's a husband, and he's screaming and yelling. My wife's being held at gunpoint inside his car with another lady, and we form a team. We go down this really long alley. It's about 100 yards long, and I had to give up my rifle at that point. So all I had was my 45, and my rifle is my go-to for the second half of my career. And so we come around the corner, and sure enough, we see this guy standing facing a car with a big freaking loaded handgun, basically pointing inside the window of his car. At this point, we're all just pretty much hand signals until we get around the corner. Come around, I see the guy, and I come up, and I'm like, hey, Phoenix PD dropped the gun, and he basically takes about 7 or 8 seconds, and he looks in my direction, and still holding the gun at these two ladies that are screaming inside his car, and I'm holding the gun on him, and he looks at me, and then he looks back at them, and then within about about 7 or 8 second span, he finally lowers the gun. And for guys that understand, an absolute eternity, and I'm going, oh my god, dude, please just whatever you're going to do, if you're going to point the gun at somebody, point it at me, so I'm justified in pulling the trigger, God forbid. Had a spot picked out on the side of his head. I was gonna drop him if I needed to, and luckily he didn't. He laid the gun down on the ground. We got him proned out. I went up there, and I'm helping secure him as the lethal coverage. 2 or 3 of the other guys are going hands on. And when I went to holster my weapon, I was completely slacked out on the trigger. And as a longtime firearms tactical rifle instructor, I knew at that very second that I was no longer fit for duty. If I can't remember to take my friggin' finger off the trigger while I'm putting it back in my holster, I was no good to the law enforcement community. And literally very next day, drop paper and call it quits. So,
Well, that doesn't happen overnight, right? So there's kind of a process, and we'll work our way to that point as we have this conversation today. But I would just from that quick observation and from that quick story, there's already several things that that a police officer listening is going to pick up on that are also pretty impressive, right? The fact that we used, or your team, you use hand signals, you knew what you were coordinating your efforts, probably people you've worked with a lot. you found a position of cover, you gave yourself time, you gave yourself space, you gave yourself, create the reactionary gap. And then on top of that, you issued the commands and even had, outcomes played out in your head. A sight picture, where you're going to shoot. For that is not the sign of an officer that's in condition black. And we, for the listeners that are not familiar with that, condition black is what we call it's the amygdala overload, where the stress is just too much, and we can't think our way through a stressful situation. That's about as simple as I can put it.
Well put. I love that. Yeah, it's a great description.
Sometimes when we're under stress, we're not thinking about anything. That's the biggest concern, is that an officer is not thinking about anything, that they've gone into that condition black. You also have very rare cases at the complete other end of the spectrum where people are not scared at all, like they're completely relaxed. The fear factor is gone entirely, which also is not healthy. So but there's always that space in between where we want to try to oscillate in that. Stress is not necessarily a bad thing. Stress is what keeps us alive. But too much stress, an overload of stress, and the ultimate emotional dysregulation that comes from unmitigated, unmanaged stress, that's when we get in trouble.
Very true. Yeah. And I tried to stay in the middle of that as much as I could, of consciously thinking about it. But sometimes, your brain takes over and makes you do that. You're like, okay. All right. And
yeah. So for you, I mean, what was there any thought or any idea, maybe I need to go speak with a counselor, maybe I need to go to EAP, maybe there's a way for me to work through this, or maybe it's just, look, I've created this line in the sand in my own head, real or imagined. That's, that was my, something like this was a decision point for me, and I decided, hey, this is it. I've had enough.
I had been shrunk pretty well at that point. Been through some pretty horrific things in the last couple of years of my career, and did actually finally seek out help on my own, which was fantastic. And I got to be honest with you, when I physically walked out the door for the last time, it was like the biggest weight ever being lifted off my chest. And that was the civilian side of the healing that I so desperately needed. On the internal side, the professional side of the healing started 2 years earlier. And I didn't realize that, they were pretty much even in my existence, how much I needed both, for the professional side to maintain my career for the last 2 years. And then after I left, to maintain my own mental stability, to be back in the regular world, if you will. It was a tough struggle. So,
well, how do you feel like you're doing today?
I'm absolutely losing. I'm living the dream. I can't stand it. I feel guilty that things are going so well. But on a little side note, I gotta throw this out there. So, if anybody's familiar with the guys from 22-0, I reached out to them to help with being a sponsor for my company that I do a lot of public speaking for. Really more just a resource, if anything else. Long story short, I reached out to them and I said, hey, would you like to do a little session with us? I'm like, no, I'm good. I just love what you guys do, blah, blah, blah. We're going to run you through a session. All right, fine. And as it turned out, they picked some stuff out of my childhood from 37 years ago that I'd still been hanging on to. And I thought that I was completely 100% squared away. And then they pulled this stuff out of nowhere. And I'm like, holy cow. And so now, combined with being out of the game, being retired, living at the beach, got my girlfriend who's loved my life, all these kinds of things. And now with that childhood trauma that I'd been apparently hanging on to gone, I can't imagine life being any better. So, it's just awesome.
Just one little thread, right? Sometimes that's all it takes.
And I was just like I was when I was on the force. I'm like, oh, I'm fine. No. Okay, well let's find out.
Yeah, so if for people that are not familiar with 22-0, maybe let's give them a quick little shout out.
Oh God, just love those guys. Dan Jarvis and his team. Just saw Dr. Pam out in Dallas. I was out there with my girlfriend doing a conference out there. The stuff that they do, it's not based on medication or anything else. They kind of retrain your brain just a little bit, and it's not some weird reverse Jedi mind trick stuff. They basically they retrain your brain to think about things from a different angle. And of course, I got it down to a science, and it was probably some of the most effective healing I've ever had, even considering all the other stuff I went through on the force. I was like, what the hell just happened here? I mean, it was awesome. It was awesome. I just loved it. So now I plugged in whenever I can ever get an opportunity.
So are they military or law enforcement or both?
Military and law enforcement, which they are
Public
nonprofit.
safety. Okay.
Yeah, all public safety stuff, and they are 100% free for either one of those communities. Dispatchers, families, everything. So they're donation based, and when they've got a case that needs to be handled in a different manner, if you will, then they'll send them out to professionals, and then it starts getting into a cost, which is completely separate from what they do. And of course, I'm not a representative. I'm not part of their community as far as being a member. But I do endorse what they do because it's such an awesome thing that they do. I just love it. So,
well, I appreciate you giving the brief shout out. And the reason I asked you to do that is because now we're going to go back a little bit, and now we're going to kind of get to the crux of the conversation. And I think it's important, especially for people I think that listen to generally our audience, and for this podcast, we're thinking about police officer optimization, right? How do we bring our best self to the job every day? How do we hire healthy, retire healthy? And it is a comprehensive task. You can't keep things in silos and expect to have a machine, the human machine that's going to run on all cylinders. You can run on a couple, let's just if we're an 8-cylinder engine, you can run on 6 for a while, you can run on 4 for a while, and you can even run on 2 for a while, but eventually that's going to catch up with you. And so companies, really, sometimes I think we've got to look we got to look inward before we look outward. All right, now I'm going to read something again. Chris is the author of a book, When That Day Comes, Training for the Fight, and who we wrote with Natalie June Riley. Let's go right to the prologue. I just want to read this for just a minute. The day it happened. 20 years and 64 days. That was long enough for me. Among my peers, I was labeled the resident magnet in 3 separate precincts. I was not reaching for that goal, but over time, it became a badge of honor of sorts, one that I took pride in. I would hold many badges throughout my career in law enforcement. As a street cop, I was honored to do so. This is me, Christopher Matthew Hoyer, otherwise known as magnet. This term is used in enforcement and dispatch settings. It generally means that things are rolling along smoothly until a certain cop arrives on scene. That happens when this asshole is on duty. Most magnets are not only aware of their precondition to attract problems for their department or shift, but are quite proud of it. I got a lot of attention on the street. Some folks were entertained, if not amused, by my incredible luck. Others were waiting for me to screw up. I may have pandered to both audiences, but overall, I made a habit out of doing the job right. At the end of the day, I was great at catching, but not so much at cleaning. Processing and report writing was not really my specialty. Dispatch would call me out by my first name over the radio, which was strictly out of policy. Christopher? I heard that a few times in my career. It was code for, you should probably mellow out. Sometimes just for fun, I would switch channels and announce my intentions when crossing precinct boundaries. Often dispatch would scold, do not start anything over here, mister. Yes, ma'am. I've only had one dispatcher quit because of my antics. It wasn't really my fault-ish. It was typical patrol stuff and misinterpreting illegals being dropped off for a drug deal, in which case led to 3 separate foot pursuits, 2 of which ended in physical fights. 2 cars fled the scene, so I requested a helicopter and a canine unit. I guess it was all too much for the dispatcher to handle. As soon as we were secure, I was told she dropped her headset and quit right on the spot. Sorry, that was not my intention. Radio codes differ from place to place. Most agencies around the country use 10 codes with some variation, but beyond that, I think they are more or less agency specific, albeit somewhat similar between cities for cross-patching purposes. One of my favorite codes was the suspicious person. After a short time on the street, having developed strong on-view skills in respect to spotting and chasing bad guys, I found that for me, they were all suspicious. The suspicious person calls were more like a game of Mad Libs. They were all pretty much sounded the same for the varying verbs and adverbs attached to them. On average, the suspicious person call occurred at least once a shift. Because of my suspicious nature, a good buddy, squad mate of mine, coined a word just for me. I remember it clearly. We were cruising the streets one day when I identified my target. I turned to my squad car mate and said, "Hey man, you see that guy?" I'll never forget his response. "Dude, that can't all be Crispicious." Crispicious. And I'm going to leave it right there. Crispicious. I love it.
Yeah, I had a few of those. I had the Crisol, the Crisute. I had a few more. I can't remember what they were. I mean, I wasn't that bad.
The Chris Mudgeon.
Yeah.
Maybe that was the dispatcher's word for you, right?
I'm sure they had a few words for me. Yeah.
Sometime on air, sometimes not. Well, see, I every cop out there knew everybody knows the magnets, and every agency has at least one, generally more than one. So and this is where we'll go back a little bit. You started in 1997, and in 1999 you were involved in your first officer-involved shooting.
Correct.
So, and then your second a year later.
Yep.
So, walk us through that. What was your first shooting like?
The first one, it was kind of strange because it was actually a dog. It was a 150-pound Rottie, and I basically got out there, and a couple of guys were like, "Hey, this dog's been holding us. He won't let us get to our car. He can't let us work and whatever else." So they crossed the road. The dog followed him over there, believe it or not, and was literally just freaking hounding him for like 45 minutes. So I get out there, and I'm, brand new, I'm off probation, I think, at that point, luckily. So get out there, put on my cape. I'm like, I can handle dogs. I'm really good with animals. And I called, for rabies. Rabies isn't coming. You're like, no, we're not coming out there. All right, cool, fine, whatever. I can handle this. Get out there, and I had a plan. So I had my pepper spray in my hand, and I didn't realize that there were actually two. So I went to the one I thought it was, who looked pretty docile. Start, making contact with that one. Turned out it was a female that was in heat, and her partner, so to speak, comes out of nowhere and literally latches onto my gun hand. I'm like, oh. So I still got the scar to this day, believe it or not, which is kind of funny. So he basically sinks his teeth into my hand, and of course I ripped my hand out of his mouth, and he charges at me, and I moved it to this last second. He runs headlong into my car as I'm pepper spraying him, and I basically start dancing around the back of my car, and he kind of comes to, he literally, like, I mean, I can't, he runs into the wheel of my car, falls over, gets back up, and now he's tracking on me. And as I'm backing up, I draw out, and from 12 feet away, he's running full speed. He's getting ready. He's going down on all fours to lunge. And I just cranked off one round, put a round in his head, just miraculous shot. There was none of this, front sight picture and smooth trigger press and all. No, it was like, oh shit, kind of a panic shot. So put him down, and of course, me being new and stupid, I put out a freaking 998 over the radio, in which I still to this day get grief for. Like, dude, and I didn't know any better. I mean, for all I know, I was kind of in panic mode, because I'll tell you what, man, there's a very strange feeling about standing in the middle of a busy street and shooting your gun. It's a weird feeling. So I kind of went into panic mode. I'm like, I'll put it out really quick. So fast forward a year almost later, 11 months later. This is August 99 was the first one. July of
Well,
2000.
before you go on to the second one, I think it's important to talk a little bit about this for those that may be listening that are not in law enforcement. You made that sound pretty casual, but that's nowhere near casual. And there's probably not a lot of officers out there that haven't had to go home mid shift to clean their drawers out like once from an animal attack or a dog. I mean, dogs are amazing animals and creatures, and police officers don't like to shoot dogs, but sometimes it is a necessity. um yeah, I just immediately when you were telling that story, and I'm going through the reel in my head. I mean, we very sadly in our city we had a small child, an infant basically, that was mauled by a dog and killed. An officer had to shoot and kill the dog. We had a woman that was pinned by her own dog in her backyard and was getting mauled and mutilated by the dog. And they were able to, the dog I think eventually got euthanized, but the officers there were able to use a taser and stop the attack. But we've had multiple cases over the years, and that's every police department in America. And it's kind of sad because generally, dogs are a reflection of the care and the treatment and the way that they've been raised. And some people just don't raise dogs well, and they become a significant threat to neighborhoods and particularly to children. But you've got the scar to prove it in your hand.
Yeah,
That can be a career ending, if not a life ending, attack from a dog, especially from a big Rottweiler.
well, I talk about it in a book where, I realized very quickly that this was a situation that, I had to control. And if it was a rabies person, they're going to probably show up with a snare. And are they going to be able to handle this 150-pound dog without a weapon, without a gun or something like that? And then I go to the worst case scenario. What if it's the mom jogging with her baby carriage?
Oh
And
gosh, yeah.
and I started thinking about all these worst cases that could have been the outcome had I not been there. So I started realizing that, yeah, I mean, I do say it was just a dog, but it was a big deal. It really was, and
And very common. And this was, we're talking late 90s, and there are a lot more tools. Tasers weren't even a thing back then, right? So a taser wasn't an option. And a taser is a risky proposition with a charging animal. It's not like it, even with a firearm, right? It's not like you just point, shoot, and the dog goes down. Even in our SWAT, my early SWAT days, we didn't have the net guns, we didn't have tasers, so you had to have alternative plans for how you were going to secure a dog on a warrant raid or something like that, so it doesn't injure any officers or anyone else. Yeah, we could do a show just on that alone. We'll have to get an animal control officer on here someday.
Yeah, that'd be
Real
great.
stories of the animal control officers.
I'm sure you have too, but I've seen some pretty horrific stuff out there, man. And it's like, holy cow. I mean, I was happened to be lucky enough to be the one to take care of it. Came with a little bit of a price, but the dog did try to sue us later, and my boss was like, "Well, see, ag assault on a police officer and all these other kind of things. So yeah, you want to go that route?" And he's like, "Yeah, maybe not so much." So it's
Yeah.
like, come on, dude, whatever.
So, all right. So now we're a year later. You have another shooting.
Correct. Yes. This one was weird because I had my very first civilian ride along, who ended up being a friend of mine, comes rides with me, and we're like, yeah, okay, cool. It's just a normal day, and we're leaving Circle K, and we got our car full of goodies to go snack because we don't want to sit down and eat anywhere because God forbid we might miss something, right?
Right.
So
Get it in the car. Let's go.
yeah, let's go. We had it all loaded up with whatever junk food we had, and that was our day. So this is about 11:45 ish in the morning on a Saturday, I think it was, if I remember right. And hot call comes out. Basically, it's an accident. And long story short on that, basically, this guy had stolen a car, had run from officers in another area of the city, and had made his way into our area, which I wasn't aware of. And he basically plants his car literally under the semi trailer of a tractor trailer. I'm like, holy cow! I still don't know to this day how the guy got out of that car, but he did. So, being the resident magnet that I was, I'm literally like a half mile away. A call comes out, and I really hated doing accidents. I'm like, I don't really want any part of this. But then the second half of the call comes out. They're like, subject was last seen running with a gun. Now that's the kind of stuff I can get into. I'm like, all right, cool, we can go for that. So I was going anyways. Bust down to the scene. I'm down there in like 30 seconds, and now a crowd is formed, and they're all pointing like, he ran east. He's got a gun. I'm like, all right, cool. So I put it out on the radio, start heading that direction. I'm on a little bit of a track, if you will, and I pull up to what I think is probably the most likely area he's going to be in. So we get out of the car, and this guy comes running out of his store. He's like, he ran through my store. I'm like, oh, cool. All right, we're on the right location here. So I can see from the front door straight to the back door, there's a guy standing out in the back that looks just like the subject of this investigation now. So I've got my plan in place. I'm going to run out. I'm just going to tackle this guy, get me done with it. And I get out the door, and all of a sudden I hear this screaming going further to my right, as it turned out. And she screamed, he's in my car. He's in my car. I'm like, okay, well, it turned out this other guy wasn't the one. He's another witness that was looking around. So I go out and I see what ended up being an older style Cadillac and this freaking chud sitting in the front seat of his car. And I'm like, oh, well, that must be him. Right. So now it's starting to look like options. What do I do here? Being young and new, the last location that I put out was, okay, he was last seen running eastbound. We're going to head that direction. And that's the last thing I got on the radio and said. So radio didn't know where I was, which is kind of a problem. Very, very, very fortunately, air support was coming overhead right around the same time when I found the guy inside the car, which I have no recollection of that whatsoever. Because I'm so focused on this guy. Not quite in the black, but I'm definitely in that red zone, and it's a fight, So it's an internal fight mentally at this point. I'm not physically fighting with the guy. And so my options are, well, do I pull the guy out of the car knowing he's got a gun? Or do I try to block his car in, which I can't do because I parked on the opposite side of the building. By the time I get to my car, get back around to where he's at, he's going to be gone, of course. So I'm in between two cars. I walk up, full uniform. It's broad daylight. It's Phoenix. It's freaking July. It's hotter than hell outside. And I walk up there, and of course I got my gun out, and I'm giving the guy commands. And he's got what ended up being about an 8-inch straight slotted throwing knife in his left hand. And I can't see where the gun is because it's somewhere laying on the front seat of the car. Okay, cool. So he starts cracking the column of his car. He's already working on it because he knows that the older style GM cars, if you get the column at a certain spot, you can manipulate the ignition with your fingers. And he knows he's a professional car thief. That's what he does. So he's working on it, and I go up there and I'm giving him commands, and that's clearly not going to work because I'm standing over him, and he's like, basically, F you, I'm not doing shit. Yeah. No. What do I do now, right? So I retreated back to the back of the car. I come back up for a second go around, if you will. And then I start realizing, well, and I want to try to say this was forward thinking, but it really wasn't. I wanted to try to create a distraction to force him out of the car. But what do I have to do that? Well, I can't shoot him yet because he's really not a threat to me because we got a barrier between us. So I start kicking the window of the car. I thought, well, maybe this will work. I'll show him that I'm really serious this time, right? So kicked it once with my left foot, didn't work. I could retreat back for cover, go back up a second time, kick it again the second time, doesn't work. I go back for cover again, and I'll go back the third time. And the reason I didn't use my primary foot because I didn't want to lose sight, and I didn't want to shoot my toe off at the same time, God forbid, which I was smart enough not to do at that point, luckily. So but that third go around, I could hear the car starting to crank, and I'm like, oh man, I gotta get something done now. So I leaned back on the car behind me and got more force, used my primary foot, my right foot, and was able to kick and shatter the window of the car, driver's side door window. What that does, basically, he kind of leans to his right side. He's kind of trying to shield his face from the glass, and he reaches down on the seat and gets the gun up to about a 45-degree angle in my direction, and I opened fire on him and cranked off 2 rounds. The second round went through the door of the car right below his arm, but the first round caught him in the arm bone right below the shoulder, and as it turned out, now I know later, went straight through his arm, straight to his heart, and he was pretty much done at that time. So I'm like, holy shit. And then the panic set in. So
yeah. Well, and then you actually have time to kind of sit back and think about, well, what just happened here? And that's this is maybe a good time to talk about a few things. One, we hear a lot today about de-escalation, and I think that unfortunately, I think there's a large part of the public that has been, kind of misled about what this de-escalation is and what it means. And, every police officer is trained in de-escalation from day one, because you try to avoid physical confrontations, particularly those involving, force and, the escalation of the use of deadly force. But sometimes it's unavoidable. And when people just always assume, maybe it's because of popular media, movies, stuff like that. Like, you point the gun at somebody and you tell them, hey, stop what you're doing, get out of the car. Oh, you got me, sir. Yes. Okay. Let me just comply now. And that's just not the case. And especially for, hardened criminals that have been around the block a few times, they know, hey, look, he's not going to shoot me. So this is my opportunity to get away, and I'm going to get away, and I'm not stopping, and I'm not complying. And we've for a suspect like that, without knowing all the case particulars, right? He's already been involved in a forcible felony. He's been involved in a serious crash, put the public at significant risk, and so the risk of him fleeing at that point is, it's easy. It's a logical next step. It's a conclusion that's going to present a significant risk to serious bodily harm, injury, or death to others. And so you have a decision in that moment, right? What's the best way to stop them? And, there are some today that would say, well, in that case today, it's better just to let him go and we'll catch him later. Well, those are always going to be a case by case decision. And, policy in the end, you're going to be dictated by what your policy is, what your state law is, and, what the use of force rules are. But it's not as simple as it sounds, is it?
Not at all. And here's the problem, and I use this model all the time when I speak, as I hold a pencil or a pen up to my nose and I drop it to the floor. And that's the time frame you have to make a decision on a critical incident, So you got a second and a half, 2 seconds. And don't get me wrong, of course, we're trained and we do de-escalate and we can figure out certain things. But the fact of the matter is, you're still a human. You still got that 3/4 of a second to make that decision, when it just comes to your brain, and then you've got to react to that, and then you've got to formulate a plan and all this kind of stuff. Now, training will certainly get you ahead of the curve, but you still only got a certain amount of time to make a decision on something that could either take your life or take somebody else's life. It's just a fact.
Yeah, and you don't control the variables. You only control the variables within your control. Right. But suspects always have a say. And that's the part that people sometimes lose sight of, is that it's action reaction. And that moment is very fast, and it comes on you fast. And so this is it, I think it's an interesting way to juxtapose this. Right now, you fast forward to the end of your career, when and we'll go back and we'll talk about your next shooting in a second. But now you realize, right? I've been down this road. I've been through these several times, and you can, I worked 27 years in one day as a police officer. My last 10 were, I was a chief, primarily in an administrative capacity. So, the likelihood of me getting involved in any kind of use of force or deadly force altercation for the last 10 years of my career, extremely, extremely low. Probably about the same as they are today, right? Going to the grocery store or whatever, encountering something. But that's not the way it was for, the better half of the first, 2/3 of my career. And it's, I think if people would just take a moment to kind of think things through in as rationally as you can, and try to remove emotion as much as you can for what the process in that decision making is. Experience is just something sometimes you just have to learn as you go. And you mentioned it, you can train, and we can talk about that in a second, but you still have to experience it. And so by the time you get to the end of your career, you recognize, hey, look, something's not right here. I've been through this several times before, and my mind and my reactions are a little bit different now. And so maybe it's time to take a step back and reassess.
That's absolutely true. Yeah. And when I had, 2 or 3 years on young and on fire, I mean, it was, very, like I joked about earlier, it's like, none of the smooth trigger press and all that. It was like, kind of almost panic fire. I mean, it was directed fire, don't get me wrong. Took care of the job both times. But that last one, God forbid in 2018, when I was slacking out on that trigger, all that other stuff I had gone through that we'll talk about was all kind of flowing through my brain, thinking to myself, if I got to go through this again, I may not recover from it. I'm so far, gone from, where I started to where I ended is a whole nother dynamic. It's like, oh, I just don't know if I can do it.
So, just a couple of things real quick to break down there. Again, when you're young, even the first few years, even as you start, and Phoenix PD is obviously a large metropolitan police department with a very high level of activity. So you're getting a lot of calls like that. It's not like these are something that only happens once a month or once every couple months. These are probably pretty frequent types of calls. And now, thankfully, they don't all end in gunfire. And matter of fact, most of them don't, right? Very, very few cases in the grand scheme of things ever end that way. But it is also unusual for officers to be involved in multiple shootings. And it does seem to be when it is, that's generally how you get termed magnet or other colorful expressions for.
It certainly didn't help, I'll tell you that. So.
Well, and again, and I think the reason is pretty obvious. It's, certain officers are always first there, and, certain officers are always the last there. Right. They always, even when they're closest, they find a way to be the last ones on scene. So, and I'm sure that's the same way in every profession. And I think a lot of that is, kind of a psychological boundary, a protection, like, maybe a little bit of fear, a little bit of, a lack of confidence in being able to manage a crisis incident. But when it comes to training and when it comes to experience, here is another brilliant and poignant example of why investment in policing is so important and so critical. Defunding the police does not reduce the risk of officer-involved shootings. And I don't know if I can scream that any louder or get people to understand that. In fact, it actually increases the likelihood that you're going to have more officer-involved shootings because you're going to have less experienced officers with less training, less development, and under more pressure. And it's just a recipe for disaster.
I agree 100%. And I mean, I say it this way, but since I'm retired, I can get away a little bit more. But that comes from a place of ignorance that people just don't know. They're uneducated. They don't understand the dynamic of, critical incidents at all, and or the training that is required to get officers where they need to be to survive any kind of a, confrontation, whatever it is, physical, mental, even dealing with regular emotionally disturbed people, you still got to have a level of training to be able to manage those things. And we're talking a lot of worst case scenario, the bigger stuff, but it doesn't disclude the little stuff that you got to deal with on a daily basis, the regular, missing child or, low key domestic violence. All those things are all factored in that they're not taking all that into account. So.
Yeah. And and I want to talk a little bit here in a bit about rifles, because you made a mention earlier, like second half of your career, your rifle was your go-to weapon. And if you consider that some in the public think that is a sign of over militarization of the police, where police are carrying around automatic rifles. or generally they're semi-automatics. SWAT teams sometimes will have fully automatic, but it's a rarity when anyone in law enforcement uses a quote machine gun. So the most important tool that any police officer can employ is the 6 inches between their ears. Like, what's going on in the brain? How can I process information? And how can I make the best decisions based on the information that I have in combination with my personal and professional experience, my training, and the equipment that is given to me to try to get the job done?
Well, I got to just take that a step further, because that's exactly right. And a lot of people think that officers go out there with the intent of trying to hurt people. That could not be further from the truth. That is not what we're there for. We just want to go out there and just make everybody safe, and sometimes we get challenged, and we're not going to just be victimized and beat up and spit on. And sometimes we got to defend ourselves. And yeah, that does come with the turf, but at the same time, I'm not going to let somebody take full advantage of me and run me into the ground and try to kill me. It doesn't work that way, so.
Right. Yeah, you've got just as much right to go home every night. And quite frankly, what people need to understand is if the police officers out there won't hold the line, aren't expected to hold the line, then the assumption that some make is that, well, people won't commit the crimes then. And it's just kind of like, when you really break down the logic, it makes zero sense. And then quite frankly, there's just a lot of absurdity to it. And in the end, it's really about 10% of the population that screams the loudest, maybe 15 these days. Generally, 10% of the other on the opposite end of the spectrum is, probably way too heavy-handed and would like the police to do more than they do. But most people, I think, are in that 70 to 80% where they understand that the police have a difficult job. They're placed in difficult circumstances, and we need to adequately prepare them to be able to successfully accomplish the mission in our communities that we need them to, and that's to maintain law and order and to keep the public safe.
Amen. I agree.
All right. So now you've been involved in your first shooting involving a person, 2 shootings, and you're just a couple of years on the job. So mentally, what kind of, what's the space you're in at that point in your career?
It was kind of strange, because I ended up making Officer of the Year right after that. And I was like, okay, I'm getting awarded for killing somebody, which is, it kind of plays on your mind. I was a little bit older, so I was pushing 30 by that point. So I had a little bit more life experience, but I can imagine for a young kid, I mean, I call them a kid, they're obviously adults, but
right.
You're in the early 20s, and you get that kind of an accolade. It could probably play on your brain just a little bit. And it did with me. And what I came away from that, both of those experiences, were I'm simply reacting to what they did. You touched on that earlier. And so I never had any guilt about having to take a life. It's like, look, I've got, a child at home I need to get home to. I got a wife at home I need to get home to. And as it turned out, I found out 4 days later, my wife was pregnant at the time. I'm like, holy cow, can imagine, had I not done what I did, this guy, as it turns out, what I found out later was he was not only a bad guy and on my day, but he pulled a shotgun on my field training officer a year before and had 3 felony warrants outstanding for his arrest that particular day. I was like, holy cow, this dude's a bad guy, and if I don't take care of business, he's just going to continue on his rampage. And some other guy is probably going to have to face this guy. If I don't do it now, it's going to be somebody else later on. So, so all that, I was feeling pretty confident in my abilities. I'm like, okay, I've kind of, I've started to earn my badge a little bit. I've kind of cut my teeth. Wasn't feeling at all arrogant, but definitely more confident in my ability to just simply do my job, so.
Well, yeah, it is interesting. And, sometimes it seems because you want to reward officers for good behavior, for demonstrating professionalism. But, the flip side to that coin, right, is that, on the other end of the bullet is another human being. And, that can really mess with a person and their psyche and you don't come into this profession, to kill people. You come in to help people, but sometimes that's the only choice, and that's what's going to happen. And in your case, if you don't pull the trigger when you do, we're talking a quarter of a second, a half a second longer, and that's you, that's laying there in the road, and then he finishes hot wiring that car, and he's off and running, and then undoubtedly going to be involved in a similar incident right down the road, right, as everyone else closes in. So sometimes in order to save a life, you have to take a life, and that's the bottom line.
Well, the fact is, it sounds kind of bad to say it this way, but I knew what I was getting into when I joined the law enforcement community. This guy knew what he was doing when he decided to steal a car that day, and when he decided to confront the police. It's like, I mean,
And when he ran with a gun in his hand, when he had a knife in his hand, and when he's
all that.
crashing cars, putting the public at risk, with 3 warrants. And this is not, and this is what people, I hope maybe they get out of it. This is not a rarity. This is not the exception. This is the everyday life of a street cop in America today. This is what we're dealing with. These are the 2% of the calls that drive 80 to 90% of the serious issues in your communities. And we need people out there like you were doing, and those that are out there today doing that job, to make sure that we maintain law and order and keep people safe.
I agree, and I feel, blessed that I was able to handle it and take care of it, in a timely manner on some level, I guess. But, had I failed, where would that have left me and or the public and my family, and in my law enforcement family, it
Right.
would have been bad, so.
Let's move forward a little bit, and you were involved in another officer involved shooting, which is what was the time span for that next one to occur?
So my last one was 2000. This one was 2013. So we're talking, 11 years later, give or take. And now, I do have a lot more investigative experience under my belt. I made it to a specialty squad, so I've got some undercover experience and clearly a lot more time on. So, and I've got more instructorships under my belt as well, which helps me learn how to teach other guys, which makes me that much better on the street. So fast forward, I got a new partner. Just got my rifle back in 2011, so I had about 2 years. And the rifle story, I failed the rifle school the first time, came back, and then literally, I'm not kidding you, day one with the long gun, we're pulling up to the gate. Hot call comes out, subject with a rifle in an apartment complex, cranking off rounds. I'm like, oh my God. My partner at the time was like, dude, are you kidding me? So we get out there, and it ended up being nothing. We took the guy down, didn't have to shoot him or anything else. So day one, I'm already getting experience with this long gun. So,
But you're glad you had it, right?
I actually wrote an email to the rifle squad, and I had no intention of it going any further, just to the sergeant. But he ended up using that email as an endorsement for the rifle squad, so we could get more rifles on the street. He goes, hey, and basically what I said was the confidence this thing gave me from 35 yards away. I knew there was no way I was going to miss, because I was, after 70 hours of training, which is because I failed the first one, I had to go back for the second go around. I had 100% confidence in my abilities of shooting that gun. It was unbelievable. So it was great. It was spot on. So fast forward 2013 now, I got another new partner, and hot call comes out, stolen car. We're on the far west side of town. The car it's actually a truck, gets stolen on the east side of town. He's coming down the I-10, which is the main artery that goes through the valley in Arizona. And I told my partner, I told Scotty, I'm like, hey, we're going to find that guy. He's like, yeah, I'm sure we will. And sure enough, we get off the freeway, get right back on to go back westbound. And I swear to God, within 2 seconds, there he is. Like, oh, there he is. And he's got 2 or 3 undercover guys following him. They're on the radio, like, yeah, we got the vehicle, we're heading westbound. So we're now the second marked unit with the conga line, if you will. So the mark units hold back, waiting for the aircraft to get overhead. We got to get out of town because we got air support coming, but they've got to wait till we clear one of the local airports before they can deploy, if you will. So we're following with the undercovers, and the lead mark unit gets up, and they're like, "Okay, we got the air support. Let's go ahead and light them up." And sure enough, officer lights them up, and pursuit's on, and he holds on for just long enough time to initiate the felony flight on the guy. He shuts down, backs off. The UCs, the undercovers, they converge. They get back in position, and I'm maybe a quarter mile back. Mark Carr. I'm sure if he looked in his mirror, he could probably see us back there. But we hold him back close enough to where we're not going to lose the guy, but close enough to where if he bails, we got a good chance of catching him on foot. So from about a quarter mile back, I'm watching. He's all the way in the far left-hand lane, and 5 lanes over from where he's at is a tanker truck semi, and this guy from 70 miles an hour with basically what ended up being a flatbed F550 Ford flatbed truck goes at a 45-degree angle and catches the trailer of this semi tanker truck. And I'm like, oh my God. The truck completely jackknifes, and the guy's intention, I assume, was probably to make the truck roll, explode, going to take us right out of the fight, and he's on his way. Fortunately, the driver of the truck was heads up, mashes the gas, rights the trailer. As we're driving by, we look up and we see the guy, the driver, and his eyes are about as big as pie plates, which no surprise there.
Yeah, no kidding.
Even I was kind of freaked out. I'm like, I've never seen anything like that before in my life. And so I tell Scotty, I'm like, dude, get your gun. We're gonna shoot this guy. And so Scotty grabs his rifle, and fast forward toward the end of the whole thing, he has now taken out 2 other semis for a total of 3, literally just trying to run them off the road, trying to get us out of the fight. He basically makes contact and does hit and runs with 17 other cars for a total of 20 vehicles, including what ended up being another officer from another agency. His motorcycle was parked in the street. He's doing traffic control. The guy basically just plows right into the bike and just destroys it. He goes into another area, and he's coming down this long stretch of road. And my thought process at the time was like, well, this guy's going to take out 4 or 5 of us when he rolls that truck and takes, God only knows if he's armed or not. We don't even know. And so I decided to back off, and I was hanging back about a half a mile or so. Obviously, I'm driving, and my thought process was when he crashes and he bails, I'm just going to run his over and just be done with it. Which did actually happen in Arizona once before, which is just one of the greatest things I've ever seen. But didn't happen that way. So he goes down this long stretch of road. For whatever reason, decides to make a U-turn, and now we've got marked units. We're like lights and sirens chasing the guy. It's full blown pursuit. 35 minutes into it, give or take, which is about average for a Phoenix thing like this, because it happens all the time out there. You see it on the news. It's like LA. The guy makes a U-turn in this huge giant truck and goes head on with a patrol car. Holy shit, a big Tahoe. The officer in the Tahoe puts a rifle round through his own windshield and through the bad guy's windshield and misses his head by centimeters. We went back later and looked, and the round was dead center right in the headrest. So the guy moved out of the way. What ended up happening is the officer stopped, had enough time to put the car into park, and when he hit head on, it forced the car into reverse and launched him into a ditch going backwards. Holy shit. So the officers, when the guy made the U-turn, they had already stopped on the side of the road. The undercover guys got out, and they were cranking off rounds at this guy as he's driving off. So I see this from about a half a mile away. So I pull off on the side of the road, and I mean, I got to tell you, there's nothing out there. I mean, it's a road and a ditch. That's it. We have nowhere to go. And so I stop the car. Scotty gets out. He gets in the front of the Tahoe about 10 or 12 feet in front. And if you can picture, we're facing south, but looking east is a street sign. And Scotty made the conscious decision, when that guy doesn't stop, when he gets to that street sign, I'm going to light him up. Well, 20 or so feet back from there, where I was standing outside the Tahoe, the driver's side, there was another street sign, and I basically had said the same thing. That's my point. When it's point of no return, if he doesn't stop before he gets to that street sign, I'm going to light him up as well. Unplanned event, as it turned out, but sure enough, the guy's coming He's barreling down the road. We estimated between about 55 and 60 miles an hour, 28 yards from our shooting platforms, if you will. He gets to that street sign, and Scott hits him with the rifle, cranks off 7 rounds. 2 seconds later, he gets to my sign, and I crank off 9 rounds with my rifle, put him through the door, and he ultimately stops about 250 yards up the road. And then we went up there, formed a big plan. We got a whole giant entourage of undercover cars, marked cars, K9, everything. Formulated a plan to get him out of the truck and ultimately extract him out and get him into custody. He later died at the hospital, from what I'm told. I never did find out for sure whatever happened with that part of the investigation, but in a nutshell, that was pretty much what happened on that one. So
Yeah, that's like you ever seen the movie To Live and Die in LA?
yeah,
That's what I was envisioning in my head, like the chase going down the freeway. The danger that someone can create in a car in a pursuit, especially in a big truck like that, is clearly a danger to the public. So you're now 11 years. This is like total of 13, 14 years. And you've been involved in several police action shootings. Feel like there was any type of pressure building on you personally or anything? Or do you feel like, hey, I'm good, I got this under control, this is just life policing in Phoenix?
Yep, that was my attitude, and it wasn't based off of arrogance. It was just, like we do. I'm just pounding my chest. I'm good, And it was kind of bad because I ended up being the senior guy on that particular scene, including my sergeant, which was kind of funny. And when we go to do the citizen review board, the chief at the time that was helping with that investigation, she's like, well, we're going to do this and this and this. And I stopped her and I said, hey, chief, may I step in and can just fix something? And she goes, absolutely, please do. I said, well, if we do it in chronological order, it's going to be easier for the folks to understand it. And she goes, yeah, let's do it that way. So now I've got, my partner's going, dude, that's a chief and you're correcting her. And I'm going, yeah, but you understand why I did it. And so now I've kind of got this little bit more confidence about, well, I don't get me wrong, I didn't say it this way, nor would I ever, but I'm basically telling the chief what to do, but it was for the side of simplicity, if you will, more than anything. So
right. Well, yeah, that's important to make sure that you get everybody's perspective, because in the end, what you want is you want to get all the answers and you want to make sure everybody understands what happened.
Well, that's absolutely true. And, basically what she wanted to do is she wanted to start with us and then go to the kid that was in the Tahoe and then go to the officers. I'm like, you're going in reverse because, it should start with these guys over here jumping out and into this and into this and then how it ended over here. And let's just do it in chronological order that way, because civilians that aren't involved in the law enforcement community directly, they're not going to understand, well, why did you guys do this and then do this? And well, that's going to just get confusing. So,
yeah, well, and it makes sense, right? Because sometimes, when people are looking at outcomes, they're not looking at processes. They're trying to judge outcomes without understanding the process. And that's always a recipe for failure.
Well, not only that, but then, just like my first shooting, when I figured out from that one, or my second one, I should say, was, the level of force that started here and it went up to here and then to here. And that's what we did. We escalated. We tried everything we could do to not have to shoot this guy. But at some point in time, we just can't let this guy continue on with what he's doing. So,
So let's fast forward now to the last shooting that you were involved in.
Got it. Okay. So that was May of 2016. We had it was just a regular day. We had a couple dumb kids that were doing some stupid stuff on the street, and I ended up taking some marijuana off this guy for whatever reason. Decided not to book him. I'm at the station. It's 2:30 in the afternoon, and I'm booking the weed, whatever else. Then hot call comes out of a burglary, and it's like 15 miles out of the way. It's not even in my area, and I heard the call come up, but I'm not paying attention to it, And then about 5 minutes later, our lieutenant gets on the radio, and he's of course he's monitoring the call. He goes, hey, we need somebody to go down and scout the house. We need a plainclothes guy. And my first reaction was, oh, it's 2:30. I still got an hour and a half to get into something. Yeah, okay, that's smart, right? Dumbass. course, I've been doing it that way for 18 years. So what's the difference, right? So
Why
uh,
change now?
yeah, why change now? I mean, hell, it's a Wednesday. I mean, I still got a couple more days of work. I might as well just go have some fun, you know. So I hop in a hot rod. I go shooting down there, and it takes me about close to 20 minutes to get down there. So now we're um, well, maybe it was a little bit before 2:30 when the call came out. So it's about close to 10 minutes to 3, give or take now. And I get out there, I'm scouting it out. I'm like, okay, this is what I got. I got a van in a driveway and nothing else. Okay. So drive down, I pass the house, I flip back around. And keep in mind, I've been doing the specialty squad job for now 14 years. It's called the Neighborhood Enforcement Team, where we do patrol in marked cars. We do, like I was doing that particular day, we do patrol in unmarked cars, but it's still in a kind of a uniform of some sort, just basically jeans and a t-shirt and an outer carrier vest. Or sometimes we just do undercover work straight up, buying dope or, buying guns or whatever we did. So I had a tremendous amount of experience, not only on the force, but with the neighborhood enforcement team as well. So, and you guys called for a scout, and I'm like, well, yeah, this is right up my alley. I'll go down there. So I'm parked about 5 houses away, and I'm putting out information. At the time, I'm gearing up with all my cool stuff. Got my heavy vest on, all tacked out, and got my rifle, got the Kevlar helmet, and all the cool stuff. And I'm out there watching the house for 13 minutes, which is very significant for after when we talk about it. And so I get on the radio and I'm like, hey, I got a car in the driveway. That's all I have. There's no foot traffic. There's no vehicle traffic. There's really nothing going on. All right, cool. All right, start rallying the troops. So they start sending marked cars down the street. And mind you, I'm parked on the west side of the street. The target house is on the east side. Of course, it's now facing west. And I'm looking to my northeast, if that makes sense. So I see the marked cars coming down the street. A couple guys block the streets to the north, more to the streets to the south, blah, blah, blah. So they're disembarking probably more, 10 or 12 houses away from where I'm at, like 5 or so houses from the target location. So Dave Glasser, turned out he was riding with his partner, Ryan Lee, makes the impromptu decision that, hey, what we have is basically a dad that called saying the son was suicidal, wants to have a shootout with the cops. Oh, well, that's kind of a problem. We know he's on dope. We know he's got access to at least one gun inside the house and this vehicle. So the thought process at the time was, for Dave at least, was, well, we don't want to have a rolling gunfight if this guy is able to access his car, and we've got cops all over the place. We don't want this guy driving down the street and shooting at us. So he makes a decision to go ahead and block in the van. Okay, I thought it was a pretty sound tactic. I've had several guys I've asked, I'm like, dude, what do you guys think? Was that a sound tactic, or should he have gone another way? And I've only had one other guy, there's a SWAT guy from Ohio, say, well, he should have gone and come in from the other direction. I said, well, that's all fine and great, but now he's completely exposed to the front door and the front window of the house. So he was less exposed on the driver's side, if you will. Neither here nor there now. Dave pulls up in the driveway, basically blocking the guy's van in. And I start to disembark from my undercover, and I'm walking out in the street, and I get out to the middle of no man's land, and gunfire erupts. And I'm like, holy, where is this guy at? And turned out he's sitting inside the driver's seat of that van. And remember that 13 minutes I'm out there watching that van by myself. This is what I've been doing for 14 years, 18 years on the department, and I never saw the guy inside the car because he basically laying in wait. He's hiding. He knows we're coming for him. There's no question in his mind. Straight up ambush. I mean, by definition. Basically what he does is, as soon as Dave starts to get out of his car, the guy opens his door, reaches back and fires 3 rounds. First round goes through Dave's door, catches him in the knee. Second round goes past everything, catches another Tahoe parked on the street. And then the third round catches Dave's A-pillar on his door. And they think the round split in 2 and caught Dave in the head, just around the hairline. And it's like, holy. So before I even knew what was going on, Dave was already down on the ground dead. And gunfire erupts from all the other guys that are on that side of the car. And it wasn't contagious fire by any means, but I'm up on my side facing northeast. And my area of responsibility was basically the south side of the house, window, front door. and I can clearly see there's nobody over there. And in that 2 second process of deduction, I realized the guy must be inside the driver's seat of this car. So I come up and empty a first volley of rounds. I estimate between 7 and 10 rounds into the middle window of his car, thinking, well, that should solve the problem. I got to take a sidestep to this whole thing. Now, remember the 3 other shootings I got involved with: a target turns, raise and fire 2 rounds, stand by, wait for the pizzas, right? No big deal. Well, what I failed to realize was that doesn't always work, because unfortunately I had trained my brain subconsciously of what does a shooting look like. I had never really processed through what a gunfight looks like. So I get done with that first volley of rounds. Now, keeping in mind I'm also an instructor, which we tell people all the time: when you get done shooting, stay on target, stay on target, stay on target. I teach this all the time. What do you think I did? As soon as I get done shooting, I come off target to go take a look at what I've now just accomplished. And then what do you think happens? The guy starts shooting back at me. Holy shit. So my brain is thinking, shooting, 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 we're good to go. We'll put 10 rounds of rifle down there, down range, it'll solve the problem. And then it didn't work. So there's failure number one in that gunfight. So I come off target, I move off the X, and I come back up for that second volley of rounds. And of course, my fingers are working faster than my brain, so I'm doing the typical thing where I'm climbing as I'm coming up on target. So I put that first 6 rounds into his door, and then I start making contact with him through the window. I put another 15 or so rounds into him, so for a total of 22 rounds before he's finally done. And that the gunfight portion, that was pretty much where it ended after that. After that, it was pretty much securing the scene, getting Dave extricated out and get him loaded up, which is a whole nother conversation too about training. So that's where we are with that one. So.
Well, yeah, and sadly, sometimes it takes tragedy to, realize that I can always be better. I don't have it all figured out, or, as an agency, you can do things better. As a profession, we can train and do things better. But some things you just can't prepare for every eventuality. And sometimes it's important to do AARs, and it's important, I think, to really go through a sound process of evaluation. Like, okay, what could we have done differently? But like when you mentioned a SWAT officer from another state might provide some recommendations or suggestions. Hey, did you think about this? And it's always easy to armchair quarterback, right? And it's easy to second guess, and I'm sure they were doing it in a constructive way. Like,
Oh, absolutely. Totally.
Sometimes people, but sometimes people are just critical about it, right? Particularly, I think citizens get a little particular about the number of rounds fired. Like, well, why that's excessive. Like, why did you shoot 22 times? That's way too much. And, the flippant answer might be because, well, 21 wasn't enough and 23 was going to be too much. But there's a lot of truth to that answer. And you made the comment, right? Sometimes the finger is moving faster than the brain. It's really just the brain catching, the brain is sending the signals, and the feedback loop is coming back. And it takes time, to process and slow and reevaluate. So, Force Science Institute has done amazing research in this area where they talk about why sometimes, police officers shoot people in the back. Why things like that happen, because the decision to stop, or the decision to start is in one brain and one person. Again, I come back to the other person has a say in what's happening, right? If in the example I used to use for people all the time and try to understand, like, in a particular case, if an officer shoots somebody in the back, well, if I point a gun at you and your reaction is now you're going to start pointing your gun back. Most likely you're going to either be moving, hopefully moving and pointing the gun back as you're moving to cover or getting off the X. But as that decision is being made, it's action reaction. So a person can pull a gun, point, pull the trigger and turn and run before an officer has an opportunity to process what's happening and pull the trigger and fire in return. And thus, by the time they actually pull the trigger, the person's already turned, and so a hit can be in the back. So it's the same thing as shooting through a door, especially after you just watch a partner get shot from a round that's coming from inside of a concealed location. That's not an easy thing to process in a moment. The other really important distinction there that you were talking about is recognize the difference between being in a shooting and being in a gunfight. And a lot of it's such a critical distinction, because some of the typical ways that we train, and this is why it's so important to do scenario-based training where you have different outcomes, different reactions. Dave Grossman's done tons of work, and I know you've, if I remember correctly, you've had the opportunity to meet Dave and talk about some of these things. But most of us in law enforcement have trained with him, and it's crazy the power of the brain and what the brain can project based in what people might think they're supposed to do when they're involved in shootings. But that doesn't always necessarily match with reality.
Yeah, you couldn't be more true. And I mean, you would think that it's pretty common sense, and it should be. And as an instructor, it would seem pretty clear. But until you're in it, then you're like, whoa, And if you've had success, if you want to call it that, hopefully not being inappropriate, of surviving the other three, and all of a sudden it doesn't work, and then you're like, wait a second, hang on, this isn't how I pictured this whole thing going on, so. But I say it in such a way, when I do my presentations about, combat accuracy versus target acquisition, and I show myself on the target range, and then I show what it looked like on the crime scene, and then I show a picture of my rifle. This is the biggest gun I'm allowed to carry on the street, and in that 4.5-second gunfight, basically in the next couple of minutes, I had 3 failures, and one was coming off target, and one was one of the rounds not going through the door, and one was me not retaining my magazine. It's like, holy shit, I mean, yeah, as much as I thought I was a rock star training and doing all this great stuff, I still had, I mean, I was performing, I'd say about 85%, which is fantastic. But even still, I'm already 15% behind the curve, in addition to 3 mistakes. It's like, holy shit, so the sense of dynamics is something that, all the training that you go through will still, I mean, it'll definitely make you better, make you survive. And I'm a huge, absolute, complete proponent of training. I think that's the number one way to keep yourself as safe as possible. But you're not going to be able to train for everything. You're just not. So,
well, there was an old statistic, and you probably know this. Maybe you can correct me, but I think it was, and this was from years ago when I was a firearms instructor. That when a police officer was involved in a shooting, you were looking at anywhere from like 17 to 18% in the hit rates. So that, basically for every 10 rounds police officers shoot, they hit twice. Now that's an average, right? So take that with a grain of salt. But I think the greater point there is the illustration that training is, it's not something that is an option, right? It has to be something that's done frequently, and it has to be done in a way that's actually going to prepare people for the stress of the moment. And
I mean, you're 100% right. And I think a lot of, unfortunately, myself included, when I was still learning about how to be an instructor, so many guys fail because it's like, I mean, any clown could shoot a piece of paper. Doing the basic walls, what is that really doing for you? Except for statistics and numbers that we can put back on the city council going, yeah, well, all of our people are all qualified up. But that doesn't teach you a damn thing except for like the super basic stuff. So when I teach now, it's like you're in it for good. You're in it for life, man. You gotta train to survive, and that's not the hard part. It really isn't, because I've got all kinds of great scenarios, and I'm sure being on the SWAT team, you've got a ton of great stuff there too. But it's that's the problem. So
right. Yeah. what is it? Speed is nice, but accuracy is final. So there's all kinds of sayings that that we have as firearms instructors. But this for people that are listening, or maybe from agencies that train, the reality is that most people, I think, are shocked to hear this, but a requirement, like a mandate or a requirement generally at the state level, is going to require that an officer qualify once a year on their firearm, meaning that they go and they have a basic course that they shoot that's static, and they score a certain number, and now they're qualified, and they may not shoot that firearm again for another year. But we know that these skills are perishable. The psychomotor skills are perishable, and they have to be reinforced constantly. You have to train constantly. So sometimes I'm not surprised when I see poor outcomes. And generally, when you see poor outcomes, not all the time, but generally, you could probably immediately trace it back to how was an officer prepared, how were they trained.
Yeah. And that's where I feel bad, because a lot of guys, they go to detectives or whatever else and like, I don't really need that kind of stuff anymore. Well, that's not necessarily true. But think about when you're driving home. I mean, you see one of your buddies on the side of the road getting thumped. I watched a CHP guy getting beat up the other day up here in LA, and several citizens stopped to help. But what if you're that guy and all of a sudden it does turn into a critical incident where you need to pull that trigger, and you have made the decision to not maintain that training, and one of your guys gets killed because you didn't train properly? It's like, that's worst case, of course. But
yeah. So let's bring this all the way back to the beginning. So now you've been involved in multiple critical incidents. The pressure and the experience and the outcomes of these things are building over time. What of course, that this is really that shooting is you're experiencing somebody shooting back. You're experiencing the unfortunate loss of a partner. So how what was the impact on you personally and professionally from that?
what I figured out was the day Dave was killed was when I checked out of law enforcement. When I retired 2 years later was when I figured it out. That's how screwed up I was emotionally. And it wasn't just Dave. There was several other major incidents that happened before. It wasn't involved in any shootings and stuff like that, but just other stuff that happened. And so 2018 or 2016 rather started with these things, all these three other major things happening, and then Dave. So Dave was the one that pushed me over the edge. But it was also 18 years of not properly taking care of myself. And when I, from the very beginning of the show, when I was pressing that trigger, I knew that it was all that other stuff that I had gone through before. If I got to go through this again, I may not survive it. That's why I made the decision to go ahead and retire. Do I have a problem pulling the trigger? No. Am I trigger happy? No, not in the least. However, do I have the ability to take a life if necessary? Yeah, of course. That's kind of expected in our community. Unfortunately, that's just part of the nature. But at the same time, it does take a toll on you over time, and that's exactly what happened to me. And I made a tremendous amount of mistakes after that. After Dave was killed, just I had a series of bad triggers. I had a series of good triggers too, which I'll take the opportunity now. If you invite me back for a second round, we can talk about that in greater detail.
Well, let's give a little highlight then, like a little teaser for talking about this more in depth, because that's ultimately what I want really people to walk away from is like, we can we can talk about critical incidents, and that's generally the things, that's kind of the stuff that captures people's attention. But it's but when you start getting down into the emotional stuff, and digging in there and kind of twisting around, that's when people get uncomfortable. And that's the part generally when people also tune out. They don't, that's not going to be me. I don't have to worry about that part. Would they play the hero role in their own mind about like, this is the way that I'm going to handle it. But then, And then it's not a problem until it's a problem, right?
Yeah, and I was that guy. I was a poster child for all that stuff. I'm like, oh, I'm good. Pounding my chest, walking around. Yeah, no, don't worry about me. I'm fine. Yeah, dude, you're not fine. You can't see stuff you've seen and expect to be okay. So some of my triggers, my very first one, and here's a mistake I made with triggers. I got sent home for 7 weeks, which is mostly because I couldn't get to see the psychiatrist in a timely manner because we had so many officer involved shootings at the time. It took me 7 weeks to finally get in to see the city psychiatrist. So that 7 weeks I'm sitting at home and I'm creating triggers because I'm so smart, right? And I'd been through this before. I already knew what was going to happen. I'm like, oh yeah, it'll be this and this and this. Huge mistake, as it turns out, because when it actually did happen, it was nothing like I could ever imagined. I mean, who knew, right? So my very first good trigger was working off duty, truck speeds off, whatever else, and he starts firing rounds into the air. And the first thing I do is I run to the street to go get a description of the vehicle. And it dawned on me that I can still run to the sound of the gunfire. Great trigger. It was good. It was really good for me. And I learned from that experience. Fast forward, we had another one where all the guys from Dave's scene were on this one particular call weeks and weeks later. I had a huge major anxiety attack, and I'm like, holy, I wasn't sure how to handle it. I ran back to the car. My partner at the time was super squared away. And what I realized would end up being a good trigger was, yes, everybody from Dave's scene was there on this other next call, again, weeks later, but we all left safely. Good trigger. Fast forward, now a buddy of mine gets in an officer involved shooting, and I heard that tone come out, and that set me off. That just like, I went straight into panic mode, another anxiety attack, but I end up finding the suspect vehicle, of course, because I'm the magnet, right? So I find the suspect vehicle. Now it's an undercover pursuit, basically. I'm following the guy in an undercover car. I pretty much made every mistake you can make, all the way leading up to driving into not oncoming traffic, but basically busted a red light following a patrol car and get tagged in the rear of my truck. So now I got an at-fault accident. That whole thing was just one big bad trigger, which led to my at the time sergeant give me some grief, which led me down another freaking rabbit hole of triggers, which is all bad stuff. The good part about having bad triggers, though, is I learned that yes, they're bad, but this is what I can take away from it. I didn't just kind of cover my head and go, oh, woe was me. No, bullshit. I'm gonna take it on board and figure out how in the hell do I fix this, so if I get triggered again, I know how to handle it. So in a nutshell, that's basically my trigger story.
So I mean, with all this knowledge and experience that you've been through, if you had to sum it up if you're talking to an officer that's starting their career today, what are some of the things that you would do going backwards to try to, but really just what would you do differently, knowing what you know now?
Well, I say it in a joking way to begin with, and then I get a little more serious. I joke about when you start realizing that you're getting too involved with your career, i.e., when you're in a McDonald's drive-through and she asks you if that completes your order and you answer with yes, 10-4, you gotta take a step back. You just do. And I'm sure guys are laughing, going, I'll never do that. Well, guess what? Happens all the time. I was that guy too. So that's kind of how I break into it. But then I start talking about, all the failures that I had, because we didn't talk about this, but we buried 16 guys in my 20 years, guys that showed up to work and never went home. That's another huge proponent of loss that you got to process through and continue to push forward. But if you don't take care of yourself, you're going to end up like I did, and you're going to be waking up at 2 a.m, having anxiety attacks, sitting at a stoplight, bursting out into tears for no reason whatsoever. And just because you didn't take care of yourself. And does it really take a Herculean effort to do that? No, it does not. Take a step back from time to time, share the stuff with your family, because if you don't share it with your family, is it going to be an assumption that, well, you're either, you're not going to share it with me, you're probably sharing it with somebody else, which leads to accusations and all kinds of other bad stuff, which is how I ended up divorced myself. Because that's how I was trained and taught, right? But if you open up and you don't have a problem, and you shouldn't have a problem explaining your stories and telling people, hey, you know what, coming to that realization that, you know what, I'm just not feeling well. You don't have to say I'm not okay. I don't care what you do. Just recognize that you need to take care of yourself. And I keep saying it over and over again, because if you don't, when the big one hits, like with Dave, I was already way too far behind the curve, and that just pushed me over the edge. And I'll go back and talk about it again, where it took me 2 years to figure out that Dave was killed when I checked out. And I don't want that for anybody else. I want people to thrive and have a healthy career and a healthy marriage and a healthy life and a healthy retirement. Those are all the things that'll make you do all those things by just taking care of yourself, whatever that is.
Yeah, and there's more than one way to do that, and that's kind of the idea is prehab instead of rehab, like rehabilitation. And this can be something that we can take on as individuals. I think we're getting better at this in law enforcement in talking about this up front. We're certainly a lot better about debriefing critical incidents, making sure that we have teams in place inside of our organizations to work through and process and help people process when they're involved in deadly force encounters. But there's a lot of other things, a lot of little things that go into it in terms of, it's not just the emotional aspect of it, but there's also the physical side of things that you need to take care of. You need to make sure when you're having anxiety attacks and you're feeling that pressure, it makes sleep difficult. When you don't sleep well, everything else starts to get out of, becomes a little bit more difficult. Sleep is one of the things that, I probably worry the most about with police officers. If you were to ask my advice about the number one thing that any police officer can do to improve their wellness overall, is to make sure that they're getting good sleep. That means minimum of 6 hours of uninterrupted sleep as often as you can get. And on your days off, make sure you're getting 8 to 9 hours of sleep. I put sleep above exercise. I put it above nutrition. I put it above everything else, because if you're not sleeping well, everything else is going to be more difficult. But then you do have to take those things in. Nutrition helps with sleep, not self-medicating with alcohol. Alcohol is may help you fall asleep, but you're not sleeping well when you're on alcohol. It's actually gonna make your sleep worse. You're never getting into deep sleep. You're not recovering, and that can be a big problem.
I agree. Yeah, Dave Grossman is a big proponent on that too. He's got a whole thing where he talks about, what leads to a lot of problems with sleep deprivation in general. It's unbelievable, some of the statistics he talks about. But another big thing like he talked about is nutrition. I mean, that's huge, having a good diet, because I'm that guy too. I wake up, 5 a.m, get to the station by 6, or out on the street by 6:30. First thing we do is hit QT, I got my freaking Monster and my cherry pie. And I mean, it's completely stupid, and that, but that's, and these are excuses, reasons, a habit or whatever it is, which is okay from time to time. It is, but you can't be excessive with these kinds of things. I mean, it's okay from, every once in a while, this kind of stuff, but if you maintain that good, healthy diet, which helps you sleep, which helps you perform better, all this kind of stuff makes a huge difference. It really does. It makes all the difference. So
yeah, we're looking about, what we're really talking about here is synergy, right? It's like all things working for each other, not against each other. And that's it's easier said than done. And again, that's another concern that I have when we're agencies are understaffed right now, really high demands and expectations. It puts a lot of pressure on not just the street cops, but on administrators as well. And it's that doesn't lead to the type of outcomes that we want. So you got to take time for yourself. And it's we've done a couple of shows on this already, back to like the episode with Michael Easter on Lead Yourself First, and then got some cool episodes coming up. I don't want to give them away just yet, but talking about some of the science behind this. Yeah, it's critically important. But I think we better think we better wrap it up. So I do want to close again by saying, get a copy of Chris's book, and where can people get it? How can they get a hold of you?
You're welcome to throw my email out there if you want to. Chris Hoyer 46 at Gmail.
Christopher Hoyer 46 or Chris Hoyer?
No, just Chris Hoyer.
CHRISHOYER. Common spelling.
So email is one way to find the book. And let me just throw this out there. I welcome anybody who wants to reach out to me at any time. Please do. Or the book's also on Amazon, Kindle, Audible as well. I'll be more than happy if somebody is really interested. I can send a hard copy signed, and which is really weird for me too, but yeah, I can do that. So,
that's great. Yeah.
A lot of folks want to have it in their hand. That's me. I'm an old school guy, and that's what I want.
Well, so I really appreciate you taking your time to share your story. And, I just want to let you know that how much I appreciate your sacrifice, and certainly the sacrifice for all those that didn't make it home, that were out serving your community. And it's, sadly that's a reality across America. It's, you just don't know. And it takes a lot of courage to suit up and go out there and do it. It's easy to be a critic of law enforcement. And I strongly encourage people that there's no better way to understand policing better than to go do it. And there's no better opportunity to make a difference in your community than working in public service. It's not for everybody, but yeah, thank you very much for your service. Really appreciate it.
I appreciate you, man. Thank you very much.
All right. Any final words before we shut her down? Because if we start talking again, we might go for another hour and a half.
I know, right? Yeah. Well, in the words of Dave Glasser, his thing that he told everybody was, "I love you." So there you go. So.
All right. Love you too, brother. All right. We'll end it at that. And thank you very much for spending some of your valuable time with us until the next episode of the Coptimizer Podcast. I'm 1042. Log into www.performance-protocol and learn more about how to bring this program to your agency and community.